I congratulate the Bishop of Truro on his report published 10 days ago. I would also like to thank Open Doors and Aid to the Church in Need for their tireless work on this issue. Around the world, there are horrifying stories of Christians being attacked and often killed, of churches being destroyed and Christians being persecuted and prevented from worshipping. This is happening on an industrial scale in multiple countries. Often, the governments in those countries turn a blind eye or are even responsible for the persecution themselves. Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world. The International Society for Human Rights say 80% of religious persecution in the world is against Christians. Open Doors estimates that 245 million Christians, 1 in 9 around the world, face persecution. Here are some examples. In April 2017, a young Nigerian woman, Dorcas Zaka, was murdered, along with 12 others, simply for attending an Easter Mass. Local priest Father Alexander Yaycock said that Nigerian military units stood by and did nothing while these murders took place. In November 2017, in Mina, Egypt, a mob surrounded a Coptic church, threatening worshippers inside, many of whom were also physically attacked. Local Coptic leader Anbar Macarius said that the Egyptian authorities have done nothing to bring those responsible to justice. I will.
And I think he's describing very accurately what is happening to Christians across the world. Given the involvement of the authorities in the two countries that he has given as examples, and many other countries which we give considerable aid to in form of money, in form of other expert advice, etc., does he believe that the government could put more pressure by withdrawing aid, or at least threatening to withdraw aid from them?
Yes, I completely agree with the point the Honourable Member has made. It's a point I'm going to come on to expand on in a short while. We do give lots of money to these countries where the governments themselves are turning a blind eye, or even themselves actively encouraging or carrying out persecution. We should be attaching conditions to the aid we did, and in extreme cases, even withdrawing it entirely. I agree completely with the point the Honourable Member makes. In Pakistan, Christian woman Asia Bibi was sentenced to death for blasphemy in 2010. Asia is now in safety in Canada, but the very cell in which she was incarcerated now holds Shagufta Kausara, a Christian 45-year-old mother of 4 who was sentenced to death for blasphemy in 2014. The very cell which Asia Bibi was held in now contains another Christian woman, also under sentence of death. What? I will, yes.
I welcome what he has to say. Mentioned the issue of Asia Bibi and Pakistan. Many in this House have said from the very beginning on that case that Asia was being persecuted for her faith, and that countries around the world, in line with their religious belief and commitment, should have offered her asylum. The United Kingdom should have done that. We didn't. Will the Honourable Member agree with me? After this report, will our foreign policy now change? So rather than hiving off our responsibility on religious freedom to candidate and other countries, we should offer asylum to those who are being persecuted, like Asia Bibi.
I think that is a question that requires very serious consideration, and of course there are many persecuted Christians from countries like Iraq and Syria who might wish to seek asylum as well. Last year, again in Pakistan, Sunil Salim was beaten to death by a group of doctors in the Services Hospital in Lahore when he protested about the anti-Christian abuse his heavily pregnant sister had suffered at that hospital. The US State Department says that the Pakistani government itself has engaged in or tolerated systematic, ongoing and egregious violations of religious freedom, I'm quoting. And yet, just a few weeks ago, Pakistan's Foreign Minister, speaking in Brussels, dismissed concerns as being whipped up by Western interests. His attitude is not acceptable. especially bearing in mind that the UK government sends £463 million a year in aid to Pakistan, the single biggest recipient of UK overseas aid, without attaching conditions about ending persecution of religious minorities. The litany of persecution goes on, Mr Deputy Speaker. In May 2017, 2 churches in Sudan were destroyed on the orders of the government. In June 2017, 33 Christian women in Eritrea were imprisoned by the Eritrean government simply for taking part in prayer. And in India, 24,000 Christians were physically assaulted last year. Prime Minister Modi dismissed this as being imaginary fears. He is wrong, and we should say so. Yes.
Honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's indeed giving an excellent speech on what is such a very important issue. Would he also agree with me that we have to be very careful that individuals in this country too have freedom of religious belief, particularly given the level of abuse and intolerance following from the votes last week on abortion, and also decry that St Vincent de Paul Parish in East Kilbride, my own constituency, parishioners arrived this morning to find that Our Lady in the Grotto had been destroyed by mindless vandals, and that these issues are also troubling people across the United Kingdom.
The Honourable Lady is quite right. Of course, the first place that we should champion and protect religious freedom is here in the United Kingdom. That is, of course, our first duty as Members of Parliament, but let us not also forget the duty we owe to persecuted minorities around the world to stand up and protect them as well. Let me just make a little progress, if I may, because I know time is short. In Saudi Arabia, public places of Christian worship are banned. There are regular crackdowns and raids on private Christian ceremonies, and Christians in Saudi Arabia are regularly imprisoned. Saudi Arabian schools use textbooks which teach hatred against Christians and Jews, and the country's Grand Mufti recently said that Christianity is not a religion.
You can't have a church there.
Christians are often a target for religious extremists. The example of the terrible attack in Sri Lanka in Easter this year saw 259 people murdered by Islamist extremists. And on Palm Sunday in Egypt in 2017, ISIS bombers murdered 45 Coptic Christians. In Pakistan the year before, again at Easter, the Taliban murdered 75 Christians at Easter. These are just a few of the terrible examples of the persecution and murder which Christians around the world are suffering from.
Would you give way?
I will.
Just very briefly, I'm grateful. I mean, he's making a powerful case, and the Bishop of Truro's report is a very strong one. But he would also recognise, and I'm sure my honourable friend would, that of course there are terrible cases of persecution against other religions elsewhere in the world, of whom the Muslim Rohingya in Burma is a worst recent example. Does he agree with me that there are cases about religions in general which the Foreign Office should also be considering in its policy?
Yes, of course the Foreign Office should take a strong position on the persecution of any religious minorities, and of course the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma is a particularly egregious example. So I'm certainly not saying we should ignore other examples of persecution. I am drawing the House's attention, though, to the fact that 80% of religious persecution around the world is committed against Christians, and we should be mindful of that.
Well
Indeed, yes.
Giving way, and I completely agree with the situation he's outlining, which is deeply horrific, and I too spoke on an Open Doors panel at the Labour Party conference last year. We mentioned Saudi Arabia, we mentioned Pakistan. Would you accept that there's a fundamental problem here in that we have a series of alliances, a series of relationships with those countries, but often turn a blind eye to the fact that they are not only persecuting Christians but other religious minorities? And would he also agree that actually there's a problem here, that we often don't know how many Christians are even in these countries because people are fearful of stating what their religion is in the first place?
Yes, well, I agree with both points the Honourable Member makes, both in terms of not knowing how many people are affected and the fact that we often have quite close relationships with some of these countries. And I think for Western governments to fail to act makes us in many ways complicit in some of these outrages. As the noble Lord Alton has argued many times, failing to stand up to protect minorities simply serves to encourage the persecutors. Lord Alton has often referred to the fact that the world's indifference made possible the slaughter of 1.5 million Christian Armenians between 1915 and 1917. He makes the point that if we ignore some of these atrocities, it encourages even worse atrocities to get perpetrated in the future. Lord Alton has made that point very powerfully on many occasions. Against this backdrop, the Bishop of Churo's work has never been more important. I fully support his report. The Bishop finds that the persecution and murder of Christians around the world is the most, and I quote, the most shocking abuse of human rights in the modern era. In particular, I support the Bishop's call for a UN resolution that those countries responsible for tolerating or encouraging the persecution of Christians and religious minorities instead protect them.
The Honourable Gentleman give way.
One last time, yes.
Thank you very much for giving way, and I thank the Deputy Speaker for allowing me to intervene. I'm afraid I have seen instances of Christians killing Christians, and obviously I'm referring to Bosnia, where I witnessed that. So it is not just other religions having a go at Christians, it's actually Christians on Christians, almost blue on blue, as you would say.
Yes, well, I'm aware of my honourable friend's military service in Bosnia and the fact he was present, or certainly in the country, when the Srebrenica massacre of 1995 took place. So we should be mindful of those sort of atrocities as well as the other ones we're talking about today. Returning to the Bishop of Churo's report, I also support his call for the government and the UN to impose sanctions on those countries who fail to protect religious minorities. And I further support the Bishop's call to train British diplomatic staff on this issue and make it a priority of British foreign policy to put pressure on governments who are turning a blind eye to this issue. But there is even more we can do, as one of my honourable friends suggested in an intervention earlier. Many of the countries where the persecution of Christians is tolerated or is even state-sponsored receive direct foreign aid from the United Kingdom. Many of these countries will wish to secure trade and investment deals with us. Many of these countries also buy arms from the UK, which requires a UK government export licence. I would like to see the UK government do more to link overseas aid, trade and arms exports to real progress on the persecution of religious minorities. Why should we send British taxpayers' money to a government, or indeed sell them arms, when they allow or encourage the persecution of religious minorities? Ideally, we should make sure these steps are taken on a multinational basis together with our European Union and United Nations partners. But if that cannot be secured, the UK should be prepared to act alone. The UK government cannot and must not simply mouth platitudes, but must take real action. By approving this motion today, this House will make clear its view. The government should then act.
The question is, as on the order paper, I'm going to call Susan Ellen-Jones, but can I just say to everybody, it's a 4-minute limit. Can we be very strict to each other, or otherwise somebody's going to drop off, and I don't want that to happen. Susan Ellen-Jones.
Very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the honourable member for Croydon South, who made a very thoughtful speech. And mention was made also of the honourable members for Strangford, Congleton and Glasgow East. And I was going to just thank them for requesting this debate, but I'd also like to thank them for the tireless campaigning work that they have all done in this area. But above all, it is the NGOs I think we would all wish to thank, Open Doors and the others, who have kept these issues going and in our consciousness for years. And in many cases, thanks to our